So the problem space, so let me introduce the problem space that we were working on. This is clinical trials. Clinical trials are in the life sciences industry. They are a process that helps pharmaceuticals come up with new drugs to market, to cure diseases, your cancer drugs, or any of the drugs to market. If they have to come out, they have to go through something called clinical trials, a process called clinical trials, which is like a 5 to 10 year long process. So it is usually sponsored by pharmaceuticals. In order to establish the drugs are created in the laboratory. Now it needs to go through smaller human testing, then the larger human testing before they can release it out to the masses. So it is a highly regulated industry for obvious reasons, because safety of individuals is at stake. So many times we notice there are drugs where we say side effects include nausea, vomiting, heart attack, death. So those are all things that come out from a clinical trials when they do it on people, and then they collect data. So the parties involved itself are the patients themselves who recruit themselves onto clinical trials, and the pharmaceuticals, of course, are the sponsors of a clinical trial, because they know that there is a cure to a disease in their lab, and now they're trying to take it out. And they work with hospitals. So hospitals are the safekeepers. They are the ones that will take the patient through the journey, and if there's anything, they are the ones that help them out. And now this process itself is pretty large. Like I said, 5 to 10 year long process typically, and it takes close to $1 billion to run one clinical trial. So it's a big money space as well. A lot of money is spent because this is a global problem. The drugs are coming out to the global market, and there are players that are in between, which act as middlemen. They try to mediate the trial between the pharmas, the hospitals, and the patients. Primarily, this is done in the interest of the patient. Like, there is no line between the pharmaceuticals and the patients, because that's when things can go for a toss. I mean, you can influence. That is something that you don't want. So that's the space that we were trying to work on. And apart from this, the big key player is the regulators themselves. The Food and Drug Administration in the US, as well as in India, we have the CDSCO. So these are regulatory bodies that are there in place to proof check everything that has happened in a trial, to really understand what is the output that is given, to see if there's any false play. They'll ask rerun. They will ask them to rerun one of the phases at least. There are 4 phases that happen. So any of the phases can be rerun. And because of this, there's more time involved, more money involved. So time is a critical factor. Like, the drug coming out to the market is going to get delayed. So we all know what is the repercussion of that. So that was, so quickly, again, so it requires coordination between multiple parties and some of the steps in the health data collection. So the trial itself goes like this. In order to be, so the trial goes like this. It has the drug itself and what are the rules to administer the drug. So if it's a radioactive drug, there is like a, on day 14 you have to take it, and then on day 28, then 42. It could go in any way. That comes into the trial protocol. That's like the rules of the trial. And this is like a changing document, a changing rule set. And every patient needs to be aware of what is he signing up for. I mean, that is like the fundamental of this. So every patient has to go through an informed consent process before they get onto a trial. And most of these steps are manual. So this consent process, a lot of it is manual, where the patient is just asked to sign a paper, and then that paper is now manually treated and updated into a system at the hospital, and then it moves into the system that the trial process follows. So there's like multiple steps of manual steps involved, which is time consuming. It is prone to errors. It is prone to data loss, data theft, data manipulation. So because of this, the industry itself has a safety check step at every level. So there are these middlemen players that have to make visits to hospitals to understand if the rules are being adhered to. So, and the data itself is in different silos. There's a data sitting in the hospital, there's a data sitting with the middlemen, there's the data at the pharmas. There is, that's how the industry currently is. And so one of our customers had, wanted to try to see how blockchain can impact such an industry, and they had some
things in mind. But when we heard that, we were like, this was in the last quarter of 2017, which is when the ICO rush was like at its peak. So we were like, is this just a buzzword, or is it really a game changer? We were trying to understand. The one question that we kept on asking them was, why blockchain? Was the question that we must have spent, I think, close to 2 to 3 weeks just getting that question answered. So because, and I remember going to a conference in Delhi on blockchain, where it was a pretty, life-changing conference that I went to. I know I'm exaggerating a bit, but then all I saw was Tinder on blockchain. Then I saw some things like, there was a guy from Ukraine who said this business idea that become a miner and save on heating costs in their homes in Ukraine, because it's a really cold country. So it was like, and the kind of gizmos that was given out at the conference, everything was like, just hyped up. That's what it felt like to me. There could be more to it, but this was how it was in the last quarter of 2017 when we started on this problem. So we tried to dig deep. So before we got into blockchain, we wanted to understand decentralization itself. So there are different dimensions to decentralization. There is like 3 axes primarily. There is architecturally, decentralized, which is how many physical computers is the system itself made of. That is, how many can go down, but the system can still continue. That's your architecturally centralized axis. And then there's the politically centralized, which I don't know if it's visible. So which is how many individuals or organizations who manage the system. I mean, how we split it. Is it one corporation, or is it many corporations or many individuals? Then there's the logical aspect. So does the system represent a single monolithic unit, or is it is it a swarm of things? So logical centralization, decentralization, you can look at it like this. You can try to take the system, split it into 2 halves. And if it still runs as, 2 different organisms and doing the correct things, that's a logically decentralized system. So the examples there are the traditional CDNs and BitTorrent. These are systems that are logically decentralized. In the sense, you can split a traditional CDN into 2 and it can still function as 2 CDN networks. BitTorrent, the same way. The only difference is traditional CDNs are run by one corporation, so it's politically centralized, and we know BitTorrent is open. So that is the big difference between understanding, logically decentralized and a blockchain which falls under political decentralization. Yeah, sure.
Why is civil law architecture, centralization, and decentralization?
So civil law is typically owned by one law enforcing body at the center, but there are different courts in the country itself that can add to the civil law. So it is somewhere between who are the bodies that submit to the law. I mean, how many can they uphold? Something I found and I wanted to share. I don't even know what is Esperanto. Apparently it's a language in the Europe that was created with rules by one person, but now it is evolving to become more logically decentralized. So yeah. And so traditional corporations come under the politically centralized bit, because it's run by one corporation and the decisions are made by one head office. You can think of it like that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So moving on, so we want to understand what is DLT first. DLT is like, it comes before blockchain, distributed ledger. So the ledger is what is shared across different parties. So before that, just connecting to the previous slide, the DLT is architecturally decentralized, politically decentralized, and logically centralized. If you split it, it is not going to give you that common agreed decision. That is, the consensus is not going to be right. Different systems are going to come up with different, responses. And so what do we gain from, why do we need decentralization? So there is fault tolerance, and there is not one source of truth, not one single authority that is governing the decisions, but it's more, decentralized, and more people know the source of truth. So that is like a trustless environment. That is, inherent trust is baked into the system. So the next aspect is, so blockchain is a type of DLT, how it organizes the data. it organizes data in the form of chain of blocks, and each block holds data that is already verified and validated by whoever creates the block, and it is chained to the next block. This data in the form of chain blocks is now distributed to the rest of the network. That's pretty much the name, why it gets the name blockchain. And so DLT has seen, this has been in research for a long time, but in 2008 is when Satoshi Nakamoto came out with a paper for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is built on top of blockchain technology, and it facilitated primarily financial transactions, moving cryptocurrency from one person to another without middlemen, no banks involved. So they wanted to primarily unbank everyone, and so that's what it achieved. And then comes Ethereum. So Ethereum is a little bit more generic. So Vitalik Buterin, who is the founder of Ethereum, in 2014 started this, but this had one key improvement over Bitcoin was the ability to write immutable, programmable logic that will run across different nodes, like a contract that can be run across different nodes. So for example, if we take chit funds, so they take their money, our money, and then they just go away. So now if it was programmed onto the chain, then a contract could be written that by this date, in 3 months' time, if the maturity date is reached, then it has to be automatically credited back. So that such rules can be brought in on the Ethereum blockchain. And the consensus is a very important factor to think about as well. So there are different distributed systems. There's Hadoop, there is Cassandra that runs in a distributed cluster. So there, all the nodes are owned by one corporation typically. One particular individual owns all of the nodes. Whereas since this is decentralized, there is a problem called Byzantine fault tolerance, where one of the nodes could be malicious, intentionally malicious, trying to bring down the system. So in this case, the protocol is designed to take care of such malicious nodes. So the Byzantine fault tolerance, there is a problem called Byzantine generals problem, this itself is a topic on its own, but the crux is there are 5 generals that want to attack a particular kingdom, and they are trying to send messages to each other about when to attack a particular kingdom. And now if one of them decides to turn is a spy for some reason, then how does the network handle such a scenario? That is the malicious node issue that I was talking about. So one way Bitcoin and Ethereum solve this is using something called proof of work, where in order to add a new transaction, a new block to the chain, you have to do some work. You have to prove that you want to keep up the trustlessness in the system. So we can think of proof of work like every actor having to do some time-consuming activity. For example, it could be a puzzle such as finding the prime number that has 2 6s in it. Now this could take some time. So to verify it, it's going to be really easy because we all know how to verify what is a prime number. But then to generate a prime number with certain rules, that's going to be the harder puzzle to solve. So that's essentially the proof of work consensus algorithm, where the creating takes time, but verifying takes hardly any time. So this is a Merkel tree. This is how data is stored. This is the fundamental part of what makes blockchains work. So this is exactly how blocks look in Bitcoin. So what happens is, this is one single transaction. There is a hash of the transaction, and there are more than one transaction in a block. So the SHA-256 hash of the transaction is taken, and then the hash of hashes is taken, and all the way up to the Merkel root, which forms the one block on the chain. So this way you can verify cryptographically. I just want to open this demo. This is a very nice demo. Can this thing do anything? Karun? Mouse is here, okay, nice. Okay, so this is a very nice demo. I think if any of you are new to blockchain, I definitely recommend playing with this. Is this visible? So I'll share the slides on the meetup thing so that you can get the link. So this is a bunch of blocks on the chain, and every block can have any amount of data. So this is like a simulation of what a blockchain is. And if you put just a second. So if I try to change this data, the whole thing goes red. So what happens is all the hashes have gone wrong. When I go back, it becomes green. So let me try to change the last block and then show you what. So that block is where the problem is. That final block is where somebody tried to alter it. So the one way to fix it is to mine it again, which is when, so if you notice all the hashes that we see in the other blocks, the protocol that this particular thing, which Ethereum also follows, is first 4 zeros is the way to have, the hashes should start with first 4 zeros. So now a miner, whenever he has to add a new block, he has to mine to find the nonce value that will help him get the block to go green. I mean, that nonce calculation happens, and then we are able to verify the fact that the blockchain is non-tampered. I think it's in the protocol. It starts off with defining anything in the protocol, but that's how I know it. If you're trying to come up with your own blockchain, you can pick anything. Okay. That's the. Yeah. As the chain grows, inherently also the difficulty is an increasing aspect. So 1 second. So going back to the problem that we were facing, so we tried to ask the questions to get to the key drivers for using blockchain in that space. So what we got to realize was there is a need for understanding the events that happen in this trial process, clinical trial process. That is, the occurrence of an event is really crucial, more than the data itself. So not all the system processes need data from other processes to perform any workflow. So for instance, like I told you, these could be drugs which have a compliance thing that a patient should come in every week and try to visit the doctor, get a bunch of tests done, and take the next pill, which is the next dose. And in such a case, the fact that a patient visited, that event is good enough, more than what happened in the data that was collected in that visit. If you think a patient misses one of the events, and if a red flag is raised, that is a compliance violation. The hospital that is running the trial is not doing something right. So these are things that enhance the quality of a trial when you have these kind of metrics. So just the knowledge that an event has happened is enough for the workflow to progress, and we know that the trial is on track. And the other thing is the sender of the event is also of prime importance. The knowing that who is the sender, the identity of the sender, and at what time. That's like, these are the two things that come with a transaction. When it happened, who did it, and what happened. I mean, we can, if that data is there, then that helps the sponsor take the next remediation actions as quickly as possible. And there is also another fact where the sponsors work with different laboratories for different tests, and hospitals as well. So as they finish up, now there is a contract in these as well. When the laboratory finishes giving the test reports for N patients, they will get paid. Similarly, the hospitals, if you're midway through the trial, at least 3 weeks have passed, there's a contract that the hospitals and the pharmas get into, they get paid. So there is this that can now happen thanks to these events coming in time, real time, and in a trustable manner. So that is something they wanted to try out a few use cases on that. One of the things that we tried out was trying to get the patient's informed consent on the enabled via a DLT, as well as the patient's visits data collection, as well as some data collection from some of the wearables. That is also another thing that is disrupting this industry. Clinical trials are trying to adopt more wearables to get more metrics about the patient's health, so that they can intervene at sooner than later. They get better results. They're able to do better statistics to prove the efficiency of a drug. So now with all, this is all we had when we started off. So the design considerations that we had to think about from there was, we needed a shared ledger among multiple parties. We needed it to be decentralized, no one authority, there should be more than one authority. And it has to be tamper resistant. That is, modifications are extremely hard, because that itself is a debatable term, depends on if people collude, what if nodes collude, and that. But this is an improvisation was over what was there. Modifications become extremely hard. And one other thing around the tamper resistant part that we did do a quick spike on was trying to see if periodically we'll take a hash of the entire chain and try to keep a marker on the public chain, so that is definitely believable, if at all this network's quality is in question. But that wasn't the case in the pilots that we ran. We had nodes to do that. Then data integrity is another aspect, which is you should be able to go back in time and check who made a change, who made a particular change at what time. Then the smart contracts, which is the executable logic that I spoke to you about, in order to manage some of the critical workflows in the process. That is, like I said, there is a protocol document which lists the rules of a study, and that goes through changes during the course of the study, which means patients would have to go through a reconsenting procedure. New version has to be, they have to be compliant at all times in a study to continue in a study. If they miss out reading the newer version, then they don't have critical information, and this could be.
In all these considerations, where is the Byzantine fault tolerance being applied? Where is your spy? Why is that consensus used?
There are different types of consensus.
Right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned there's a DFT that is being used.
Correct.
Right? In the case of a clinical trial, a PFT assumes that there's a spy. Right? There's someone
Correct.
who's not that particular person.
Correct.
In the entire project, was there a scenario that exactly that happened? Why is that particular consensus used?
Correct. So,
The DLT aspect of it.
correct. Yes.
It makes sense.
Yes.
But why does it? I don't think the consensus makes sense.
Correct. So, I mean, I'm coming to that. I'm just trying, I did talk about the consensus in detail, trying to set the context for blockchain so far. And then I'll tell you what we did and the design considerations and why we chose Ethereum. Yeah. So, and then the next thing, so the non-italicized points apply to any public blockchain. Whereas there are these other two aspects, which is one is permissioned, where you permission the nodes that can join a network, because this is a safe space that is definitely not going to be public, it is a private network. And there is another point around data privacy, where you choose which data to share with which node. That's another aspect that we were trying to look into as well. And so we did choose Ethereum for this particular problem, because back when we started on this particular problem, there were other DLT implementations like Fabric and Corda, which were in a really nascent stage. There was no production systems that were built, whereas Ethereum and Quorum were things where we had seen a lot of applications in the local community itself had been, had gone to production. It was a more stable release than Fabric, which was in version 0.6 when we had started, and it got, I think, sometime last year, mid last year is when the 1.0 was released, and there were issues trying to get things to work in the way we wanted. So we wanted the pilots to happen, and then maybe pivot to change the blockchain layer in the architecture, so which is what I'm going to get into. So the questions that we had from that was, what is the role of the blockchain? Should we have it as a DApp, which is a decentralized app, or is it a client server, backed by blockchain, built on top of blockchain? And then what do we store on the chain? What is shared between the nodes and what is centralized? These were decisions that we had to make. What implementation? How do we store the private keys? Because usability is a concern. These private keys are, not really usable to the layman. Like a patient, you can't really ask him to handle the private keys per se. So we had to do some improvisations in that layer. We had to have a custom layer there. And consensus, who are the nodes is a question that we had to figure out.
Using a combination of
No, it was like a custom user authentication layer built with something called as HT wallets. I'll get to that. So going into that, so what is the role of blockchain? So decentralized app is very common in the blockchain world, and client server is something that we are all familiar with, and this was like, cutting edge technology, but we were building something for an enterprise client where it has to work. It is a pilot that is run for a global pharma, and we didn't want to, they were not really inclined to jumping at bleeding edge technology either. They wanted something that would protect the security of the patients as well. They wanted to try out this new technology, this disruption to the centralized space that they were in, but they didn't want something like a DApp either. So what is a DApp? So DApp typically comprises of your, your web application, which is your front end, and the blockchain network. Now these can directly talk to each other. Transactions can be sent all the way from your browser to the network. So, and the ways to do that are either you run your own local node, that's one way, but then that didn't fit into this problem. So the other way is to use a layer which tries to do this for you. MetaMask is a very common plugin that is used to submit these transactions all the way to the ledger. What MetaMask does in the back end is it runs nodes itself, which is capable of signing. All that the browser will manage is the private keys of the person. It's like a wallet on the browser, and then transactions get signed and then submitted to the nodes owned by MetaMask, and from there it goes to the network itself. So, and this is the one that we tried to choose because of the considerations that I just spoke to you about. So there is the front end, and there is a key management layer, and the rest are your typical, your API layer, all of your APIs, and underneath you have the blockchain where there is a DApp layer, DApp API layer, through which the transactions go all the way to the chain. This is the solution that we chose to do. And the next factor was what to store on the chain. We had to think about factors around that, where storage profile was an important point to keep in mind. So in a traditional app that you're using, what you store in your database is probably, you can multiply it by the number of customers that you're working with. Now in this case, you need to multiply it by the number of participants in the network as well. There is redundancy, and when there's a new node joining the network, they have to get all of this data as well. So you got to be cognizant of the fact that what do you store on the chain. That is one factor that we try to keep in mind. And the other is the scale itself, how the transactions times can start getting slow if you put everything on the ledger. And this was like, we needed, real-time, we had real-time uses for this application, so we couldn't really rely, we had to be cognizant of that. And privacy, which is to do with some of the privacy laws in this space, are GDPR, like any other. And HIPAA is a Patient Protection Act, which is the backbone of the life sciences industry as well. So where there should be a way to forget yourself, the need to be forgotten, whereas a ledger is, immutable forever. So this is something that we had to, keep in mind at every data, point that we were trying to store. We had to understand what to keep on the ledger, what to keep off the ledger, what is shared, what is not shared between the nodes. So because of the first thing that I told you, that the pharma and the patient never have a link, no patient data is ever in the vicinity of the architecture needed to support that. So summarizing what I just said, so what did we keep on the ledger finally were the events that were important. So we had timestamped events on the ledger, and we had critical workflow logic where event to event state transition, if it was not possible, it would error out. There are these compliance checks that happen that let you not go forward. These are things that we modeled on the ledger. And off-chain, we had to share the public keys of the people as well as the reference data of the contracts and things like that. That is something that was shared between the nodes. The rest were not shared, depending on the type of the node, hospital or something. That is when that's where the data goes. So the next thing is around how did we manage private keys. So private keys, is a very large number that is used to generate your public key. So it is the address on the network, it is your identity on the network. So, and the private key allows you to sign transactions, and wallets help you store private keys. This is typically. So we chanced about something called HD wallets. These are convenient wallets which can generate infinite number of accounts for you, deterministic accounts, given a master seed phrase of 12 to 15 words. This is like the bib specification, and if you lose those 15 words, you're gone. So this was getting us further, but still making the patients key in something like a 15 words or trying to make them use a wallet was not realistic. So we had to have a custom layer using vault type of things where we would store a patient's seed phrase in a secure vault, and that could be unlocked only using a password, a strong password that the end user would use. So that's like the way we tried to get around the usability aspect with respect to these keys in this problem. And then so the smart contracts side of it. So it's nothing but decentralized execution logic. So we said we are going to keep some things on the chain, but how do we do it? It was all done through smart contracts. The contracts are written in Solidity for Ethereum, and so whenever an event happened, the rules go there, and then the writing to the ledger happens. And so this piece of code is something that ships to everyone in the network. It is distributed across the network, and every time you go live, you try to do a new release, then you got to, when you have your contracts changed to, they get compiled to something called an ABI, just like your Java program is compiled to a dot class. This gets compiled to an ABI and then gets run on the EVM. That's where the execution happens. So yeah. So some of the things around smart contracts and incremental delivery is what we do. We try to work agile and try to add feature by feature. And so how to do incremental delivery with the smart contracts was a question that, I mean, I've listed some of the things that we tried to do, and because this code itself is permanent, once there, it's there for good. Now how do you change it? You come up with a versioning concept, and then bug fixes as well. How do they go in? Again, come deploy a new contract onto the thing, migrate all of the data into this thing, and you get the drift, right? So what are the things that we did for writing upgradable smart contracts was, so we had a master contract, which is like a registry of all the contracts, and that would have the current active contract with respect to what we were working on. And the other thing that we tried to do was separate. So right now, a smart contract embodies both code as well as the state of the chain. The data is there. So separate data from code is a basic thing that we do in the other world, but then here that was new. In the beginning, we were still trying to understand contracts. Then slowly, as we understood, we decided, okay, let's keep a layer for all the execution logic, and let's keep all the data bits a little separate. So that worked out in some cases. But if your data structure itself goes through a change of what you're storing, then that is hell breaks loose then. And we tried to have a wrapper in place, trying to do the backward compatibility bit. That is something that we couldn't really, the complexity of it was overwhelming, so we discarded that because it was not worth it. So the next aspect that we had to decide, which comes to your point, so since we had chosen Ethereum, so we had 3 consensus algorithms that they support. So there's proof of work, which I spoke about, and there is proof of stake, that is the one with the most stake takes responsibility of creating the next block, and if something goes wrong, he loses what's at stake. So these are still anonymous, whereas there was an algorithm called proof of authority, which is best suited for private networks, because you want to decentralize it with known people. That is the essence of a private network. So these people are called as signers as opposed to miners, and the block is not mined anymore, but it's forged. I mean, it's put together, and so there are n signers, and they get to sign, I don't exactly remember the number, but every n by 2 plus 1 blocks. It's like if anybody goes out of turn, they are not adhering to the protocol, they get booted out of the network. And if a new authority has to come in, then that also comes through a special block where new authorities can be added, new signers to propose blocks. So that is the one that we try to go with, because I mean, at the end of the day, there were two options that we really had. One was going with proof of work with a customized mining difficulty, because it was a private network, and what we cared most was these multiple stakeholders should have trustable, data points to work with. So either worked pretty well for us, but I think as the scale of the system would increase, that's when whether it was proof of authority or proof of work would really make a difference. So proof of authority is actually something like a delegated proof of stake that's like known, folks coming in. So, so we're close to we're at the closing side. Just a few key takeaways are, ask the whys whenever if you're trying to work with a distributed ledger. The whys have to be very clear. Only then we can go to the how part of it, the why, the what, then the how. And business collaboration was extremely critical to understand every use case, what needs to go on the ledger and what needn't. I mean, what was the trade-off that you get by putting something on the ledger? Is it warranted? That was one key takeaway from this. And use smart contracts only when absolutely necessary. That is something, I mean, if we are trying to solve a enterprise scale problem, then because immutable, the word has a lot of pain associated with it. So judicious choices have to be made there. And of course, like anything, be ready for multiple pivots and iterations. So that's like the full. Yep, cool. Thanks, guys.